Look, if you want to know what the glamorous, star-faring future looks like, you should probably ask someone who does not spend their Tuesday mornings arguing with a repurposed industrial air purifier. I currently had my right arm jammed shoulder deep into the ventilation shaft of our apartment, blindly fishing for a filtration cartridge that seemed to have developed both artificial sentience and a deep personal grudge against me. "Come on, you stubborn piece of garbage," I muttered, scraping my knuckles against a rusted iron bracket. "You are a machine. I am a man. One of us pays rent, and I promise you it is not you." The apartment was a sprawling, drafty loft, sitting squarely above a combination three-dimensional print shop and pawnbroker in the floating port of Tacoma. The whole district bobbed gently on the tidal swells, a rhythmic swaying that you either got used to after a week or threw up to for the rest of your natural life. The air constantly smelled of salty rain, ozone, and the sharp chemical tang of the printer ink from the floor below. As a municipal storm drone technician, I made a living fixing flying robots designed to withstand Category 5 hurricanes off the Pacific coast. Yet, somehow, a domestic dust scrubber from 20 years ago was about to defeat me in my own living room. "If you threaten it, Tobin, it will only become defensive." I pulled my arm out of the vent, wiping a thick streak of black grease across my forehead. May was standing in the kitchenette, leaning against the chipped laminate counter. She had that cup in her hand, the cracked ceramic monstrosity she treated like a holy relic. "I am not threatening it," I said, pointing a grease-stained screwdriver at the wall. "I am establishing a firm chain of command. It needs to know who is in charge." May did not smile, but the corners of her violet eyes softened, just a fraction. She had been my roommate for exactly 5 years and 2 months. To look at her, you would think she was just another interstellar expatriate trying to blend into the Pacific Northwest grunge scene. Her skin had a faint, iridescent sheen in direct sunlight, catching the light like spilled oil on wet pavement. But in the grand scheme of the late 21st century, that barely warranted a second glance on the street. Earth had opened its doors a few decades back. We were the cosmic equivalent of a truck stop on a minor galactic highway. The aliens who came here were usually freight haulers, atmospheric engineers, or merchants trying to peddle cheap plasma technology for a ridiculous markup. They were regular folks working the daily grind, just like us. The concept of alien royalty, or high-born elites coming to a wet, rust-flaked city like Tacoma was laughable. If you had money, or real power in the galaxy, you went to the core systems, not to a floating barge in Washington state. May and I had established a solid rhythm. It was a stubbornly, delightfully human rhythm. We split the rent exactly 50-50. We fought over who forgot to buy the synthetic milk, and who left the lights on in the bathroom. We maintained a rigid, unforgiving schedule for washing the dishes, and our primary form of affection was a steady, comfortable stream of mutual sarcasm. "You have grease on your nose," she pointed out, taking a very slow, deliberate sip from her cracked mug. "It is a badge of honor. It shows I am a provider for this household," I shot back, tossing the screwdriver onto the faded fabric of our sofa. "Unlike some people who just stand there looking perfectly serene while I do battle with the household appliances to ensure we do not choke on smog." "I provided the funds for the replacement filter," she reminded me calmly. "And I reminded you to change it 3 weeks ago. I believe my contribution to this specific crisis is entirely complete." She had a point. She usually did. May possessed an unnerving calmness. It was not just quietness. It was a specific gravity. Whenever she stood still, it felt like the chaotic energy of the apartment just naturally aligned itself around her. Stray papers stopped fluttering in the draft. The persistent hum of the neon pawn sign outside the window seemed to dim. The chaotic mess of my workbench felt less like clutter and more like a deliberate arrangement. It was just how she was built. She anchored the room without even trying. Still, over the 5 years we had shared this drafty space, I had noticed things. Tiny, bizarre habits that did not quite fit the standard profile of a runaway freighter mechanic or a weary data clerk, which were the only two professions she ever vaguely alluded to when the topic of work came up. For one, she never watched the deep space broadcasts. Whenever the local feed cut to a diplomatic summit on Alpha Centauri or some grand, glittering festival in the Orion Arm, May would quietly stand up and leave the room. She possessed an intense, physical aversion to ceremonial music. Once, a parade marching band went by on the lower decks, playing brass and kettle drums for a local holiday, and she locked herself in her bedroom for 4 solid hours. And then, there was that cup. It was just a cheap, chipped Earth-made coffee mug with a faded logo of a diner that closed 10 years ago. But she guarded it, like it held the foundational secrets of the universe. I never asked. In 5 years, I never once pushed for her real name, her homeworld, or the reason she ended up splitting a lease with a grease monkey like me. I figured it this way. The universe is a massive, noisy, and often incredibly cruel place. Some people do not travel light years across the dark void to answer intrusive questions. They come to a rainy, forgotten corner of Earth because they just want to be left the hell alone. I respected that boundary. I had my own reasons for liking the quiet, and probing into her past felt like a violation of the silent treaty we had signed on the day she moved in. I turned back to the vent, sighing heavily. All right, one more try. If this does not work, we are living with the dust. We will embrace it. We will become one with the particulate matter. I glanced out the reinforced glass window. The morning sky over the port was a busy, chaotic mess of standard orbital traffic. Heavy lifters lumbered up through the thick, gray cloud layer, trailing white condensation lines, while sleek commuter shuttles darted between the massive floating habitat blocks. It was a completely average Tuesday morning. The most dramatic thing I anticipated dealing with today was either this cursed filter, or maybe a rogue seagull nesting inside the turbine of one of my municipal storm drones, down at the bay maintenance yard. "Do you want me to hold the flashlight?" May asked, her voice carrying that smooth, unbothered cadence that always managed to lower my blood pressure by a few points. "No, I need both my hands and my dignity for this operation," I grunted, wedging my shoulder back into the cold metallic maw of the wall. "Just stand there and project moral support. Maybe hum something non-ceremonial to keep my spirits up." I finally felt my fingers brush the edge of the plastic casing. Victory was exactly 2 inches away. I took a deep breath, braced my heavy work boots against the uneven floorboards, and prepared to yank the offending hardware out of its housing. Then, the sound came. It was a knock at the door. Normally, a knock at the door means absolutely nothing. It is a neighbor from down the hall complaining about a water leak, or someone trying to sell synthetic meat subscriptions, or the landlord demanding rent 2 days early. But nobody knocked like this anymore. We had delivery drones that buzzed your personal communications pad, or people just yelled your name from the street level until you stuck your head out the window. This knock was different. It did not rattle the cheap composite wood of our front door. It was composed of 3 distinct strikes. The timing between each strike was mathematically flawless. It was not hurried, and it was not aggressive. It was the most polite, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise sound I had ever heard. It sounded like a sound designed by a civilization that had spent 10,000 years rehearsing exactly how to ask for entry. It commanded attention without raising its voice. I froze, my arm still completely stuck inside the wall vent. The apartment suddenly went dead silent. Even the background hum of the port outside seemed to drop away, swallowed by the sudden tension in the room. I looked over my shoulder at May. The cracked mug was frozen halfway to her lips. For the first time in 5 years, the unnerving, unshakable calm of my roommate shattered completely. Her violet eyes were wide, fixed on the wooden panels of the door, and the faint iridescent color had completely drained from her skin, leaving her looking pale and terrified. The quiet, boring Tuesday I had planned was over. The universe had finally found us. I yanked my right arm out of the ductwork with a violent twist. It took 2 full seconds of frantic, awkward wiggling, ending with me scraping my elbow raw against the rusted iron grate. But the sheer absurdity of that immaculate knocking sound provided the necessary surge of adrenaline. I wiped a thick streak of black grease onto the thigh of my denim work pants and walked slowly toward the entryway. The brass door handle felt unusually cold against my palm. I pulled the heavy composite wood inward, expecting to see a frustrated landlord or a confused neighbor. There was no one standing in the gloomy, flickering corridor of our apartment building. Instead, hovering precisely at the level of my eyes, was a delivery courier. Calling this silent object a drone felt like a severe insult to whatever advanced, elegant engineering had birthed it. It was a small, perfectly geometric prism composed of matte, black panels and polished silver edges. There were no exposed rotors spinning the air, no exhaust venting ports, no humming repulsor lifts, and certainly no gaudy, brightly colored logos of Earth-based shipping conglomerates plastered across its hull. It just hung there in the stagnant, damp air of the hallway, defying the laws of gravity and absolute, chilling silence. It did not bob on the air currents. It did not weave or adjust its positioning. It possessed the smug, terrifying stillness of an object that knew the fundamental laws of physics were merely polite suggestions it could choose to ignore. The top panel of the prism slid back, retreating into itself with a sound resembling a sharply drawn breath. Inside the dark recess rested a single item. I reached out, my grease-stained fingers hesitating in the air before crossing the threshold of the hovering box. The very instant I lifted the item free, the black and silver prism folded in on itself. It collapsed in a silent, seamless cascade of shifting metallic geometric shapes and simply vanished upward through the cracked stairwell skylight, shooting into the morning clouds faster than my human eyes could track. I stepped back into the apartment and pushed the door shut, listening to the soft, definitive click of the deadbolt. I stood in the entryway and looked down at the object resting in my hands. It was an envelope, a real physical paper envelope, in an era where digital data packets moved across vast star systems in tiny fractions of a second. And physical mail was a luxury strictly reserved for high-end antiquarians or incredibly paranoid smugglers. Holding actual paper felt incredibly strange and heavy. The texture of the material was thick, resembling fine-pressed cotton, but it clearly did not originate from Earth. Woven intricately through the stark white surface of the paper was a delicate network of translucent veins. They pulsed with a faint, silvery blue light, breathing in a slow, rhythmic tempo, looking exactly like captured starlight coursing through organic capillaries. "Well," I said loudly, trying desperately to inject some of my usual dry, defensive levity into the suddenly suffocating atmosphere of the room. "I think there are only two logical explanations for this delivery. Either you are the target of a highly funded interstellar lawsuit regarding some unpaid parking tickets out in the Sirius sector, or we have just been formally invited to join a very expensive, very exclusive cosmic cult. If it is the latter option, I am drawing a hard line at wearing matching ceremonial robes." I looked up from the faintly glowing paper. May had not moved a single inch from the kitchenette. She stood perfectly rigid, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the edge of the chipped laminate counter. The cracked ceramic mug she cherished so much sat abandoned by the metal sink. I had seen her calmly negotiate with aggressive, shouting shipyard foremen. I had seen her stare down heavily armed floating port security officers without blinking an eye. Right now, she looked like she had completely forgotten the biological process of breathing. I stepped closer, holding the strange envelope out toward the light of the window. That was when I finally looked at the front of the paper. There was no return address. There were no postal routing codes. There was just a name, written in elegant, razor-sharp calligraphy that seemed to hover slightly above the surface of the paper itself. casting microscopic shadows. It did not say May. Nyrissa Kaelvain, I read aloud. The syllables felt incredibly heavy and ancient in my mouth. They carried a melodic, ceremonial weight that clashed violently with the mundane smell of old printer ink wafting up through our floorboards. I am guessing that is not a bureaucratic misprint. She did not answer immediately. She walked toward me, taking slow, mechanical steps, her violet eyes entirely consumed by the faintly glowing object resting in my palm. When she finally reached out to take it, her fingers were trembling. It was a microscopic, barely perceptible tremor, but on a woman whose defining trait was unshakable stillness. It looked like a massive earthquake. The exact moment her skin made physical contact with the paper, the envelope reacted. The silvery blue veins surged with a sudden, intense burst of luminescence. A complex, circular seal positioned dead in the center of the flap. Something I had initially mistaken for a simple blob of decorative wax bloomed into a miniature, spinning holographic lock. The bright light scanned the intricate ridges of her fingertips, but it did not stop there. The light seemed to push deep beneath her tissue, reading the hemoglobin, the cellular structure, the very unique biological signature hidden deep within her DNA. It was an authentication process so terrifyingly advanced, it made our local security scanners look like rusted padlocks. With a soft, resonant, melodic chime, the complex seal dissolved into a wisp of sparkling mist that faded into the air. The envelope unfolded itself. May reached inside and pulled out the letter. The parchment matched the envelope, though the text covering the page was written in a flowing, luminous script I could not even begin to decipher. I watched her face intently as her eyes darted across the first few glowing lines. The change in her expression was profound and entirely devastating. It was not just the simple, sharp jolt of standard fear. It was a deep, catastrophic structural collapse of her entire demeanor. I watched the faint, beautiful iridescent color drain completely from her skin, leaving her looking sickly and hollow. Her shoulders, which she usually held with that effortless, invisible, commanding authority, slumped forward under a sudden, crushing physical weight. It was the specific, agonizing look of a person who had spent years piling heavy furniture against a locked, reinforced door, only to stand there and watch the steel hinges completely disintegrate from the outside. The silence in the room stretched out, thickening and expanding until it felt like liquid metal pouring directly down my throat. The distant, familiar hum of the floating port traffic outside, the rhythmic, comforting sloshing of the ocean waves against the massive concrete pylons. Everything seemed suddenly muted, violently shoved aside by the immense gravity of whatever was written on that glowing page. "Okay," I said, forcing my voice to remain low and steady. I tossed the greasy screwdriver onto the cluttered workbench, the clatter sounding absurdly loud in the quiet room. "Listen to me. You have never once asked me for money, and I know for an absolute fact you pay your half of the rent exactly 2 days early, every single month. But if you have somehow managed to cross a dangerous planetary syndicate, or if there is a heavily armed bounty hunter currently parked in a stealth cruiser just above the city cloud layer right now, you need to tell me. We can pack our bags. Who do you owe?" "May." She slowly lowered the illuminated parchment. Her eyes met mine, and the sheer volume of deep sorrow and ancient resignation I saw swimming in her gaze made my chest suddenly tight. The pragmatic woman I had argued with over dirty dishes, who stubbornly debated grocery lists with me, was entirely gone. She was replaced by a stranger carrying a world-ending burden on her shoulders. "They are not creditors. Tobin," she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it somehow possessed a resonant, commanding edge I had never heard from her before. "It is the court." "The court," I echoed, my mind violently struggling to bridge the massive, impossible gap between our mundane domestic life and the ominous, magical glow of the letter resting in her hand. "What court are we talking about?" Are we dealing with a regional trade magistrate or some sort of massive galactic tribunal? She turned her gaze slowly toward the reinforced apartment window, looking past the grimy, salt-stained glass, looking past the smog-choked, industrial skyline of Tacoma, and staring up toward the vast, invisible expanse of the orbital traffic lanes. 5 years, she murmured softly, speaking more to the gray morning sky than to me. I genuinely thought 5 years of absolute silence would be enough time to let the trail go completely cold. I thought the machine would simply choose another to take my place. She turned back to face me, the glowing parchment in her hand casting sharp, ethereal blue shadows across her high cheekbones. The quiet, unassuming roommate facade completely crumbled away, burning up in the atmosphere, revealing something ancient, imposing, and deeply, deeply tragic. My name is Nerissa Kelvane, she stated clearly, the long, ceremonial syllables flowing smoothly and naturally from her lips this time. I am not a runaway freighter mechanic. I am not an interstellar expatriate, hiding from a bad debt on a border world. I stood there in the center of the room, the sharp smell of ozone and burnt mechanical grease clinging tightly to my clothes, feeling utterly, completely out of my depth. Then, what exactly are you? She closed her eyes for a brief, agonizing second before delivering a truth that would permanently shatter the axis of my entire existence. I am the missing queen of the Valoran Choir, she said, her voice echoing softly but firmly in the cramped, cluttered space of our cheap apartment. And my empire has finally found me. My immediate reaction to finding out my roommate was the sovereign ruler of a galactic empire, was to do what any rational, moderately stressed American would do when faced with an incomprehensible truth. I searched for her on the planetary network. Well, the localized orbital equivalent of it. Anyway, I grabbed my grease-smudged datapad from the kitchen counter, aggressively swiping past the daily port weather reports and the local sports scores, and tapped directly into the unfiltered extraterrestrial public archives. Finding the Valoran Choir was not difficult. They were not some obscure, fringe collective hiding in a dusty corner of the galaxy. Looking at their territorial map actually gave me a mild bout of physical vertigo. The holographic projection spilled out of my device and hovered over my messy workbench, painting our dingy apartment in shifting, arrogant shades of gold and deep purple. It was an alliance so vast it made our entire solar system look like a forgotten grain of sand on a sprawling cosmic beach. We were talking about trillions of citizens, thousands of inhabited worlds connected by a complex, ancient web of interstellar transit gates. Typing in the name she had just spoken was significantly harder. The public databases had been meticulously scrubbed. It was a digital erasure so thorough and precise, it practically screamed of a massive governmental cover-up. But you cannot completely delete a monarch, not even with infinite resources. I dug into the archived, unregulated Fringe World news feeds from exactly 60 months ago. There it was. A grainy, heavily censored article detailing the sudden, inexplicable disappearance of the crown heir on the very eve of her coronation. For half a decade, the greatest political powerhouse in the known universe had been quietly, desperately managed by a faceless Regency Council. I looked back at the glowing parchment still resting in her hand. The surface translation, which my datapad was now happily decoding, was terrifyingly straightforward. The council had finally tracked her biometric signature to our rainy little mudball. They were politely demanding their ruler come home immediately. The subtext, however, was basically apocalyptic. The interstellar transit gates, the vital arteries keeping their sprawling empire from collapsing into isolated, starving fragments, were destabilizing. Only the biological key of a seated monarch could recalibrate the network. I dragged a heavy hand down my face, feeling the grit of the morning's repair job still clinging to my skin. I reached for my diagnostic kit to pack it away, but my hands were shaking. I accidentally knocked my high-intensity ultraviolet inspection torch off the table, It clattered to the floor, rolling to a stop right near her boots. The intense, concentrated beam of violet light washed directly over the trailing edge of the imperial parchment. The paper reacted violently to the specific wavelength. Beneath the elegant, official demands of the Regency, a second layer of text bled through the fibrous material. It was jagged, frantic, and entirely lacking in diplomatic grace. It looked like the desperate scribbling of a ghost. I knelt down, squinting at the harsh contrast. The hidden sentence burned with a sickly, pale yellow hue under the inspection lamp. It read simply, "Do not trust any voice speaking from the throne." I slowly stood up, my joints popping loudly in the quiet room. "Okay," I said, pointing a trembling finger at the glowing warning. "I am just a guy who fixes weather drones for a living. But that right there reads exactly like the opening act of a political assassination. Are they trying to kill you? Because if your own government wants you dead, we need to leave this floating city about 10 minutes ago." Nerissa shook her head, her posture still rigid with a heavy, ancient exhaustion. She looked at me, and the vulnerability in her expression was far more terrifying than the glowing letter or the hidden code. "They do not want to kill me, Tobin," she said softly. "They want me to rule." "But the throne of the Valoran choir is not merely a chair made of precious metals. It is an archaic, biomechanical engine. It neurologically binds with the sovereign." I stared at her, the gears in my head violently grinding together as I tried to process the sheer scale of the nightmare she was describing. "It links directly to your brain." "It links to everything," she whispered, her voice tight with a profound, suffocating dread. "To ensure a monarch rules with absolute objectivity, without the taint of personal bias, emotional attachment, or selfish desire, the throne demands a toll. It systematically erodes the private memories of the ruler. It eats your childhood. It consumes your personal attachments, your grief, your private joys. It hollows you out, piece by agonizing piece, replacing your individual soul with the collective, cold logic of the empire. You become a perfect, flawless symbol of governance, a beautiful, breathing statue." The sheer horror of it finally clicked into place. The weight of her secret pressed against my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. She had not abandoned her people out of cowardice or selfishness. She had run away because she vehemently refused to be subjected to a government-mandated lobotomy wrapped in velvet and gold. She had chosen a life of hiding in a leaky, drafty apartment on a backwater planet just to retain ownership of her own mind. She had traded an entire galaxy for the right to remember who she was. I took a deep breath, trying to process the absolute absurdity of my own reality. My brain was actively malfunctioning. I had spent the last 60 months living with a galactic sovereign. I had made a literal queen take out the recycling every Tuesday night. I had once aggressively lectured the ruler of trillions about her blatant refusal to properly scrub the frying pan after making synthetic eggs. I was probably guilty of several distinct forms of high treason just by existing in my own living room in my sweatpants. I opened my mouth to apologize, or maybe to ask if I should bow, or perhaps to suggest we start packing our bags immediately. But the words never materialized. Outside our reinforced window, every single digital advertising billboard in the Tacoma floating port simultaneously glitched. The bright neon advertisements for noodle shops, hover taxis, and cheap atmospheric scrubbers vanished in an instant. They were replaced by the stark, blaring crimson insignia of the municipal emergency broadcast system. The air raid sirens, massive acoustic relics from the coastal storm warning grid, began to howl with a deafening, soul-rattling intensity that vibrated deep in my teeth. My datapad vibrated violently against the workbench, flashing an urgent, system-wide planetary alert. I rushed to the glass, wiping away the condensation with my sleeve, my heart hammering furiously against my ribs. The thick, gray morning clouds over the port were parting, but not from the ocean wind. Something massive was descending through the atmosphere. It was a diplomatic dreadnought, a starship so incomprehensibly huge it blotted out the morning sun, casting a terrifying, jagged shadow that swallowed the entire floating city. The Empire had not just sent a polite letter in the mail. They had brought the entire court to our doorstep. The local authorities of the Tacoma floating port attempted to establish a secure landing perimeter in the central commercial square, an effort that was both entirely frantic and completely unnecessary. The massive dreadnought hanging in the upper atmosphere had already rewritten the geography of the sky. It was so impossibly vast that it created a second, jagged metallic horizon, plunging our entire district into a false, chilling twilight at exactly 9 in the morning. The streetlights flickered on, confused by the sudden darkness, casting long, nervous shadows across the damp concrete. From the belly of that floating mountain, a single dropship detached and began its descent. It did not roar or burn the atmosphere like our municipal shuttles. It slipped downward in absolute, terrifying silence, shaped like a flawless teardrop of polished obsidian. It landed in the center of the plaza with a delicate grace that made the surrounding human hovercars and heavy cargo loaders look like crude, bolted-together scrap metal. It was an aesthetic insult to human engineering, parking right next to a synthetic noodle stand. I watched all of this through our grimy window, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I heard the heavy, synchronized footsteps entering our building lobby 2 minutes later. Our apartment complex did not possess an elevator, which meant the grand representatives of a multi-system empire had to walk up 3 flights of uneven, creaking wooden stairs. I stood frozen near the kitchenette, listening to the steady, rhythmic thud of their boots. The rich, pungent smell of industrial printer ink and cheap ozone from the pawn shop downstairs wafted up through the floorboards, mixing violently with the sudden, sharp scent of ionized air that seemed to precede the visitors. Nerissa stood in the center of the living room. She had not changed her clothes. She was still wearing faded denim jeans and a loose gray sweater. Yet, her entire physical geometry had shifted. The relaxed, slightly slouched posture of my roommate was gone. In her place stood a pillar of absolute, terrifying authority. She did not look toward the door with fear. She waited for it to open with the cold patience of a predator. The sharp, polite knock did not repeat. The door simply swung inward, the rusted hinges groaning loudly in protest. 3 figures stepped over the threshold, bringing the crushing weight of the cosmos directly into my cramped living room. They wore sweeping, structured garments made of fabrics that seemed to absorb the ambient light, accented with pale, glowing geometric lines that mirrored the veins of the mysterious letter. The moment the door closed behind them, all 3 aliens dropped to one knee in perfect, synchronized unison. They bowed their heads deeply, exposing the vulnerable napes of their necks. I stood awkwardly near the refrigerator, clutching a dish towel for absolutely no logical reason, completely paralyzed by the sheer absurdity of the visual. My rickety, crooked bookshelf, overflowing with cheap paperback novels and half-finished drone schematics, was serving as the backdrop for a profound historical event. The sputtering air purifier I had been wrestling with less than an hour ago was wheezing pathetically in the corner, while the highest political authorities of a galactic superpower knelt on our frayed, discount store rug. "Rise!" Nerissa commanded. The word was spoken in English, but it carried a resonant, acoustic weight that forced the air out of my lungs. The 3 figures stood. The man in the center stepped forward. He possessed sharp, aristocratic features, his silver-streaked hair pulled back tightly against his scalp. His dark eyes swept over the room, taking in the peeling paint, the mismatched chairs, and finally, me. His gaze dismissed me in a fraction of a second, categorizing me as a harmless, irrelevant piece of local furniture. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice impossibly smooth, dripping with a manufactured oily warmth that instantly made my skin crawl. "I am Regent Sorrel Kane. To find you breathing, To find you whole after these long, dark years is a blessing the choir desperately needed. I instinctively hated him. He possessed the polished, frictionless demeanor of a politician who could order an entire planetary bombardment while politely asking you to pass the salt. You did not bring a warship to a neutral border world merely to offer your blessings, Regent, Nerissa replied, her tone matching the frigid temperature of deep space. I brought a vessel capable of ensuring your safe return, Kane countered smoothly, clasping his hands behind his back. The Empire is bleeding, Nerissa. The interstellar transit gates are falling out of alignment. Without the biological resonance of a seated monarch to anchor the network, the Outer Rim territories are facing total isolation. We are looking at the catastrophic starvation of billions of citizens. The Regency Council has done everything in its power to hold the architecture together, but we require our queen. We require you to come home and stabilize the throne. The woman standing to Kane's left shifted her weight. She wore a severe, militaristic uniform, heavy with metallic commendations, and a thick scar bisected her left eyebrow. Unlike the regent, her reaction to seeing Nerissa was entirely unguarded. I saw the moisture gleaming in her eyes, the desperate, overwhelming relief of a soldier finding her lost commander. We truly believed you were dead, Majesty, she said, her voice cracking slightly. The Admiral fleet has been fractured without your guidance. Admiral Thessaroon, Nerissa acknowledged, a tiny fraction of the ice melting from her voice. It is good to see your face. It seems the Council is not entirely unified in its grief, nor its methods. Kane's smile did not waver, but the temperature in the room dropped a few more degrees. I watched the regent closely. While Thessaroon was entirely focused on her queen, Kane was subtly taking in the environment. He took 2 steps to his right, perfectly avoiding the warped floorboard that always caught my heel when I walked toward the sink. He did not glance down. He simply knew it was there. He then casually rested his hand on the back of the sofa, precisely missing the exposed spring that had ruined 3 of my shirts. A cold, heavy rock dropped into the pit of my stomach. He was not assessing the room. He already knew the layout. He knew where the structural flaws were. He knew exactly how we lived. This was not a sudden discovery. They had been watching this apartment, monitoring our mundane arguments over groceries and rent, for God knows how long. Nerissa did not flinch at the immense pressure Kane was projecting. She took a single step forward, forcing the regent to look slightly upward to meet her gaze. You speak of stabilizing the throne. Sorel, Nerissa said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, quiet register that commanded the entire room. You speak of duty and the salvation of billions. But you and I both know what the throne demands to function. The room went entirely still. The distant hum of the floating port vanished. So, I will ask you a very simple question. Regent, she continued, her words cutting through the tense air like a physical blade. Do you require me to return so I may govern my people? Or do you merely require me to return so I may offer myself as a sacrifice to the machine? The regent, Sorel Kane, launched into a meticulously rehearsed monologue about duty, galactic stability, and the tragic burdens of the crown. He spoke with the practiced cadence of a seasoned orator, his voice resonating through the cramped living space. As he spoke, I noticed a subtle inconsistency. The regent wore a small, silver translation node grafted just below his jawline. It functioned flawlessly, converting his alien syntax into perfect, unaccented English. However, a microsecond delay occurred exactly 3 times during his speech. It only happened when Kane referenced the succession crisis of 5 years ago, specifically when he mentioned the unfortunate demise of Nerissa's late brother. The tiny device sparked with a microscopic blue hesitation, as if the localized processing matrix was violently struggling to reconcile the spoken word with a contradictory baseline truth. I quietly backed away from the center of the room, letting the heavy political theater unfold between the regent and the Queen. I slid back to my cluttered workbench. The illuminated parchment rested next to my soldering iron. I picked up my drone diagnostic scanner, a heavy, modified piece of municipal hardware designed to decrypt corrupted flight logs from crashed weather turbines. I engaged the deep spectrum optic tether and aimed the scanner lens directly at the hidden yellow text I had exposed earlier. The readout on my handheld screen blinked rapidly. The primary seal on the envelope matched the official cryptography of the Regency Council perfectly. But the hidden sublayer of text, the frantic warning bleeding through the fibers, did not. It lacked the digital watermarks of the High Court. The encryption protocol was a chaotic, jury-rigged mess, bouncing off unauthorized relay nodes. The Council had not sent this letter. Someone else had piggybacked on the official diplomatic courier system, slipping a ghost into the machine. I cleared my throat, the sound sharp and abrasive against Kane's smooth rhetoric. "You said your brother died." I directed my voice at Nerissa, completely ignoring the irritated glare the regent shot in my direction. "You never mentioned him before." Nerissa turned her head slightly. The air around her seemed to freeze. "Kaler Vane," she murmured, the name carrying a profound, suffocating weight. "He was the first in line. He vanished during the preliminary purification rites, just days before the transfer of power. The Council declared it a catastrophic neural failure. They said his mind simply collapsed under the pressure of the initial link, and his body perished with it." "Well, the Council has a massive lying problem," I stated bluntly. I tapped the screen of my diagnostic scanner, pushing the processing core to its absolute limit. The fragmented yellow text on the parchment finally resolved into a complete, horrifying sentence. I read it aloud, making sure every single person in the room heard the words clearly. "Kaler is still beneath the throne floor." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the reverent quiet of a royal court. It was the suffocating, paralyzed stillness of a bomb threat. The terrifying implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. The archaic biomechanical engine she had described earlier did not merely erase the private memories of the seated ruler. It possessed a much darker function. If the throne encountered a mind that actively resisted the assimilation, a mind like Kaler's, it did not just kill the host. It severed their consciousness from their physical body and dragged their soul down into the digital dark, trapping them in the architectural roots of the palace. The machine was a prison. Sorrel Kane did not gasp or feign shock. His posture remained perfectly rigid, but his left hand instinctively twitched toward the ornate, jeweled badge pinned to his chest. My eyes locked onto that badge. As a technician, I spent 40 hours a week hunting down rogue transmission frequencies in the crowded airspace of the floating port. The Regent's badge was not merely a symbol of office. It was actively emitting a tightly focused, encrypted command pulse. It was firing a continuous, unbroken data stream straight up through the ceiling of our apartment, piercing the cloud layer, and linking directly to the massive dreadnought hovering above the city. He was not standing in our living room as a vulnerable diplomatic envoy negotiating a return. He was an active tactical commander coordinating a live operation. "He is locking us in," I said, stepping away from the workbench. "That badge is a relay. He is syncing with the warship." Kane finally dropped his polite, oily smile. The mask shattered entirely, revealing a cold, calculating predator underneath. He took a slow step backward, moving closer to the door. Before Kane could issue a vocal command, Admiral Thessa Rune shifted her position. She stepped sharply between the regent and Nerissa, her hand resting casually but dangerously close to the hilt of a weapon holstered at her hip. Thessa did not look at Kane. She kept her eyes fixed entirely on her queen. "The regent has been entirely too modest about his recent legislative accomplishments," Thessa whispered, her voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "The coronation protocols have been fundamentally altered during your absence. Majesty." The council voted to bypass the standard neural integration safeguards. If you sit on that chair under the new laws, the machine will not just erase your personal history. It will completely sever your motor functions and higher reasoning. You will be permanently bound to the network as a biological processing node. You will become a pure figurehead, entirely paralyzed, while the Regency Council wields your absolute authority through a proxy interface. The conspiracy was finally laid bare on the cheap, stained carpet of my living room. The Empire did not want their queen back to guide them. They needed her biological signature to keep the transit gates open, and they intended to turn her into a living battery to do it. I looked at Nerissa. The sovereign ruler of trillions of citizens was standing in my home, surrounded by traitors and loyalists, looking more cornered and isolated than any human being I had ever seen. The immense, crushing weight of her galactic duty was actively trying to drag her into a shallow grave. I had spent my entire life avoiding complications. I liked fixing simple machines. I liked paying my bills on time. I liked the predictable, boring rhythm of the floating port. But standing there, watching this ancient, suffocating political machine try to consume the woman who argued with me about laundry detergent, something inside my chest snapped. I walked directly past the heavily armed alien admiral and stood squarely in front of Nerissa. I did not bow. I did not lower my eyes. "Listen to me," I said, my voice harsh and completely devoid of any ceremonial respect. "I do not care about the transit gates. I do not care about the geopolitical stability of the Outer Rim territories. I care about the fact that your own government just flew halfway across the known universe to trick you into a glorified coma. Going back there to become a smiling, lobotomized corpse strapped to a chair is not a royal responsibility. It is spiritual suicide." I pointed an accusatory finger at Kane, though I kept my eyes locked on hers. "They do not want a ruler. They want a biometric key they can control. If you walk onto that ship under their terms, you are dead. The woman who buys the wrong brand of synthetic milk every single week dies today." Nerissa stared at me. The rigid, terrifying authority she had projected since the door opened seemed to crack, just slightly, around the edges. Her violet eyes searched my face, looking past the grease stains and the anger. In a room suffocating under the weight of ancient rituals, hidden daggers, and false reverence, my complete lack of protocol was the only honest thing left. I did not see a glowing symbol of divine authority. I did not see a political asset. I saw my roommate, and I was furiously telling her to fight back. A profound shift occurred in her expression. The paralyzing dread that had gripped her since the envelope arrived began to evaporate, replaced by a cold, brilliant clarity. She realized, in that chaotic moment, that I was the only person standing in the room who genuinely saw her as a human being. "You are absolutely right, Tobin," she said softly, but the resonance in her voice made the floorboards vibrate. She turned her gaze slowly toward Regent Sorrel Kane, and the look in her eyes promised an absolute, devastating reckoning. Nerissa did not break eye contact with Sorrel Kane. She simply pointed her finger toward the cracked doorway. "Wait outside in the hall, Regent, Admiral. I require a moment to confer with my host." Kane opened his mouth, his jaw tightening into a microscopic fracture of his polished veneer. But Admiral Rune immediately bowed her head. The soldier grasped the Regent firmly by his elbow and practically dragged him out into the dimly lit corridor, forcing him to comply with ancient protocol. The rusted hinges shrieked in protest. The heavy composite wood slammed shut, and the deadbolt slid into place with a loud, definitive clack. The crushing, suffocating atmosphere of galactic politics instantly vanished from the room, leaving behind only the familiar, comforting hum of the sputtering air purifier and the faint, bitter smell of roasted coffee beans drifting up from the street below. The moment we were completely alone, the terrifying, rigid posture of the sovereign ruler completely dissolved. Nerissa let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like it had been trapped violently in her lungs for 5 entire years. She walked slowly toward the kitchenette, her shoulders slumping heavily, and picked up the cracked ceramic mug resting near the metal sink. She ran her thumb over the jagged, imperfect rim. She looked incredibly fragile, entirely stripped of the imposing authority she had just wielded like a heavy broadsword. "Do you have any idea what it is like to live inside a monument?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed loudly against the peeling wallpaper of our apartment. "In the capital city of Velis Prime, nothing is simply a physical object. Nothing is just an action. Every single breath you take is a choreographed, mandatory ritual. Every word you speak is recorded, analyzed, and filed away into the historical archives by scribes who watch your every blink. You do not simply eat a meal. You partake in the ceremonial nourishment of the state. You do not sleep. You enter a monitored regenerative cycle to ensure the crown remains optimal for public viewing. You are not a person, Tobin. You are a biological component of a massive, unfeeling machine. You are suffocated by silk and gold until you completely forget what your own, authentic voice sounds like." She set the chipped mug down and pulled open the top drawer of the counter. The specific drawer where we aggressively shoved all our miscellaneous household junk. She pulled out a handful of items and spread them across the cheap laminate surface. A faded yellow public transit card from 2 years ago, a crumpled grocery list written hastily on the back of a torn envelope, 3 overdue electric bills covered in red ink, a plastic token from a cheap, noisy arcade down on the coastal boardwalk. In the Imperial Palace, I possessed sprawling vaults filled with compressed starlight and jewels forged in the hearts of dying suns, she said, gesturing vaguely to the pathetic pile of earth garbage resting on the counter. "But these things right here are the absolute most valuable objects I have ever owned in my entire existence. Do you know why? Because they are fundamentally flawed. Because they are mundane. Because nobody curated them for me. I wrote that messy grocery list. I rode that dirty, crowded subway train. I lived a life that was entirely, wonderfully ordinary. I did not run away just to survive physically, Tobin. I ran away to build a true, independent self. I needed to know exactly who I was before that archaic throne wiped my mind clean." I walked over and looked at the crumpled receipts, the sheer magnitude of her profound loneliness finally washing over me. "You built a life here," I said quietly, the anger from the confrontation bleeding out of my chest. "A real, messy one." "I did," she nodded, her violet eyes shining brightly with unshed, exhausted tears. "But the Regent was not lying about the transit gates. The network is rapidly decaying. The outer colonies rely heavily on those portals for agricultural shipments, medical supplies, and basic atmospheric maintenance. If the network completely collapses, billions of innocent people will starve in the dark, isolated from the core worlds. I cannot let my subjects die just so I can keep my quiet, selfish life in Tacoma. I have to go back. I have to stabilize the system. But I violently refuse to go back as a sacrificial lamb for Sorrel Kane's ambitions." She turned to face me fully, the intense, desperate focus returning to her gaze, burning away the vulnerability. "There is a loophole, an archaic legal statute buried deep within the foundational texts of the Valoran Choir, written thousands of years ago before the Regency Council began altering the sacred coronation protocols. It dictates that a sovereign has the divine, inarguable right to bring an outsider into the sacred integration chamber. A person completely disconnected from the empire. A witness of plain life." I frowned, wiping my grease-stained hands on a dirty shop rag. "What exactly does a witness do during a coronation?" "They act as a psychological anchor," she explained, stepping closer, the urgency radiating from her skin. "The witness must be someone who knew the monarch when they held no titles, possessed no political power, and wore no crown. During the neural integration, the throne attempts to dissolve the ruler's ego into the collective memory of the state, to create a perfect, unbiased judge. The witness stands in the direct center of the ceremony. They have the absolute, overriding legal authority to halt the protocol, to loudly challenge the machine, if they detect the High Court attempting to distort or erase the monarch's true identity. The witness holds the sovereign strictly to their humanity. She reached out and gently placed her hand over mine. Her skin was freezing cold, contrasting sharply with the feverish, wild intensity in her eyes. "I need you to be my witness, Tobin." I physically recoiled, pulling my hand back as if I had just touched a live electrical wire. "Whoa, hold on. Absolutely not. You have completely lost your mind. I am a municipal drone mechanic. I spend 8 hours a day scraping crystallized salt and seagull droppings off weather turbines. I own exactly 3 pairs of work pants, and 2 of them have holes in the knees. I do not know the first thing about galactic law, biomechanical integration machines, or royal courts. If you need a champion to fight your corrupt government, you should hire a heavily armed mercenary, or a brilliant lawyer, or someone who does not panic when the kitchen toaster sparks. A mercenary would be bought by the council before we even reach the capital," she countered fiercely, stepping directly into my space, absolutely refusing to let me retreat from the conversation. "A lawyer would be outmaneuvered by Sorrel Kane's legal scholars in 5 minutes. I do not need a warrior, and I do not need a politician. I need someone who knows the woman who lives in this drafty apartment." Sorrel Kane and the court look at me and see a divine, exploitable vessel. Admiral Rune looks at me and sees a tragic military savior. "You are the only person in the entire known universe who looks at me and just sees a highly frustrating roommate." She gestured wildly around the room. "For 5 years, you have nagged me relentlessly about leaving the bathroom lights on. You made me split the cost of a broken water heater right down the middle. You have never, not even once, bowed your head to me. You treat me like a flawed, stubborn, ordinary human being. That is exactly the anchor I desperately need to survive the machine. I need the man who argues with me over dirty dishes to stand in that room and remind me that I am real." I stared at her in stunned silence. I thought about the quiet, foggy mornings, drinking terrible, burnt coffee by the window. I thought about the comfortable, easy silence of reading on the worn, sagging sofa. I thought about the sarcastic, rapid-fire arguments over whose turn it was to carry the heavy recycling bags down 3 flights of stairs. She was actively asking me to walk straight into the dark heart of a hostile alien empire, to stand alone against a political machine that routinely crushed entire planets, armed with absolutely nothing but the fragile memory of our mundane domestic squabbles. It was the most insane, terrifying proposition I had ever heard in my entire life. I looked over at my cluttered workbench, staring at the rusted wrenches, the tangled copper wires, and the half-repaired air filters. I looked at the fading gray light bleeding through the salt-stained glass of our window. Then, I looked back at the woman who had shared my quiet, unimportant life for the last 60 months. "I am going to need to borrow a very nice suit," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck to ease the sudden, sharp tension gathering there. "And if we die in some grand, tragic cosmic betrayal because you dragged me across the galaxy, I am officially putting it on the historical record that I told you this was a terrible idea." Nerissa smiled. It was not the cold, perfect, terrifying smile of an untouchable queen, but the warm, deeply exhausted smile of May. And just like that, with a heavy sigh and a muttered complaint, I permanently stopped being a regular tenant in a floating port and became the single most dangerous variable in the entire Valoran choir. We rode the obsidian teardrop up into the belly of the diplomatic dreadnought, leaving the rainy, familiar skyline of the floating port far below. Stepping out of the pressurized airlock, I immediately realized that calling this vessel a spaceship was fundamentally inaccurate. As a municipal mechanic, I knew the stubborn nature of metal. I knew the cold, unforgiving bite of titanium alloys and the cheap, hollow ring of extruded aluminum. This architecture was not forged in a foundry. The sweeping, cavernous corridors of the dreadnought felt like stepping directly inside the ribcage of a leviathan grown in a laboratory. The walls were smooth and warm to the touch, pulsing with a faint, steady bioluminescence that shifted hues as we walked past. When Nerissa stepped onto the main command deck, the ship did not demand a retina scan, a passcode, or a drop of blood. The deck floorboards simply began to hum. A low, resonant acoustic vibration rippled up the curved bulkheads, shifting rapidly into a complex, melodic harmony. It sounded exactly like a colossal, invisible choir, softly singing her true name. The vessel itself was alive, and it recognized its master through a song woven into its very cellular structure. The sheer scale of their engineering was not just technologically advanced. It bordered on mythical magic. It made my heavy-duty storm drones back on Earth look like crude toys carved from wet mud. But as we were escorted deeper into the labyrinth of the ship over the next 12 hours, my blue-collar instincts started ringing loud, persistent alarm bells. I looked past the glittering, godlike facade and focused entirely on the people maintaining it. The Empire was wealthy beyond human comprehension, but it was starving on a spiritual level. The engineering crew we passed in the lower maintenance decks possessed dark, heavy, bruised circles under their eyes. Their hands trembled slightly as they calibrated plasma conduits. The heavily armored soldiers lining the grand, sweeping hallways were paralyzed by a suffocating discipline. Nobody spoke a single word. Nobody even breathed loudly. They moved with the terrified, mechanical precision of people who knew with absolute certainty that stepping even 1 inch outside their assigned ceremonial protocol meant being swallowed whole by the rigid system. The ship was beautiful, but it was running on sheer, unadulterated fear. Roughly 48 hours into our transit across the dark, silent void, Admiral Thessa Rune diverted us into a heavily shielded tactical room, dismissing her personal guards with a sharp, cutting flick of her wrist. She locked the heavy biometric door and turned to Nerissa, her face drawn and pale under the harsh tactical lighting. The Admiral had managed to slice into the encrypted transmissions Kane was sending ahead to the capital. She confirmed the nightmare I had decrypted on the parchment back in Tacoma. Kaler was not dead. The diagnostic readings from the Deep Palace core strongly indicated his isolated neural signature was still actively trapped, screaming in the digital dark beneath the throne room. The revelation hung in the air like a physical weight. Nerissa leaned against the cold tactical table, her shoulders shaking, and finally broke down the last heavy wall hiding her past. She told us the final, agonizing reason she had fled her home planet on the morning of her ascension. She described walking into the royal chambers exactly 1 hour after her own mother had completed the neural integration protocol. The previous queen was still physically flawless. She sat up straight in her opulent chair. She smiled gracefully, and she delivered a perfectly calibrated, mathematically flawless political speech regarding the agricultural prosperity of the Outer Rim. But when Nerissa stepped forward, reaching out a trembling hand and calling out to her, the reigning monarch simply stared back with empty, polite, terrifying confusion. The biomechanical machine had completely scrubbed the image of her own daughter from her mind. The real tragedy of this sprawling empire was not a sudden political coup or a violent rebellion. It was a centuries-old regime that had actively and legally normalized erasing human beings just to forge perfect, infallible statues. I needed something to do with my hands to stop myself from punching a massive hole in the nearest bulkhead. When we returned to our assigned guest quarters, I convinced a terrified junior technician to let me examine a sluggish data terminal embedded in the wall, claiming I just wanted to admire their circuitry before I went to sleep. It took me less than 45 minutes to bypass the superficial security layers, using the diagnostic pad I had smuggled in my coat pocket. I was looking for the historical registry, hoping to find the official, documented legal parameters for the witness of plain life. What I found instead was a massive legal blockade. Sorrel Kane had not been idle during our flight. The judicial mainframe of the ship showed a localized, preemptive override command, authorized directly by the Regent. He had quietly classified my specific human biometric profile as a dangerous foreign contaminant, legally barring me from stepping within a 3-mile radius of the central coronation chamber. He had rigged the entire game before we even left the atmosphere of Earth. He intended to separate us the moment we landed, leaving Nerissa completely alone with the machine. If Sorrel Kane wanted to play dirty with ancient imperial law, I was going to play dirty with blue-collar improvisation. I cracked open the ventilation grates near the floor of our quarters and lured in 4 small, automated scuttling drones designed to clean the air ducts. Using a cheap soldering kit and a spool of copper wire, I violently gutted their primary cleaning subroutines. I rewired their optical and audio sensors directly to my personal datapad, bypassing the internal network of the Dreadnought entirely. I turned the harmless little machines into untraceable, mobile recording devices. If the High Court intended to twist the law, isolate the Queen, and silence the truth when we reached the capital, I was going to broadcast their treason in high definition to every single viewing screen in the solar system. On the 4th day of our journey, the Dreadnought decelerated violently, dropping out of the interstellar transit gate network with a massive shockwave that rattled my teeth. The capital planet of Velis Prime filled the viewport. It was a sight that physically hurt my eyes to witness. The entire world was wrapped in a luminous, golden atmospheric halo. Massive, crystalline spires pierced the cloud layer, catching the light of their twin suns and scattering it into a billion brilliant, blinding prisms across the sky. It looked exactly like the ancient human descriptions of heaven. It was flawless, pristine, and radiating absolute power. But as the ship descended into a lower orbital trajectory to approach the docking bays, the angle of the sunlight shifted. I saw the underside of the glory. Beneath the radiant, divine upper hemisphere lay massive, choked rings of dark industrial sprawl. I saw endless continents of thick gray smog, rusted metal processing plants, and grinding machinery turning blindly in the dark. It was a planetary underbelly entirely dedicated to keeping the golden towers above illuminated and pristine. It was a perfect, horrifying physical manifestation of the Valoran choir itself. I stared down at the approaching capital, clutching my rigged datapad tightly in my hand, entirely convinced that this empire was far too beautiful to be anything but profoundly rotten at its core. Velis Prime welcomed its lost sovereign with a roar that shook the marrow in my bones. We stepped off the Dreadnought onto a sweeping balcony of polished white stone, overlooking a plaza packed with at least 2 million citizens. The sky was filled with cascading ribbons of golden light, and the cheering was absolutely deafening. Yet, as I stood slightly behind Nerissa, watching the spectacle, my stomach tied itself into a cold, tight knot. It was entirely too perfect. The adulation rolled over the crowd in precise, synchronized waves. Nobody pushed. Nobody broke the barricades. It did not feel like a spontaneous outpouring of joy from a desperate populace. It felt exactly like a massive, flawlessly directed theater production. And Sorrel Kane was the man holding the script. The moment the broadcast feeds cut away, the Regent dropped his benevolent smile. He turned to Nerissa in the grand hallway of the upper palace and casually announced that the ascension ceremony would take place in exactly 24 hours. He claimed the interstellar gate network was suffering a catastrophic degradation rate of 99% and simply could not survive another day without a seated monarch. I knew a grifter when I saw one. Back at the floating port, whenever a salvage dealer tried to rush me into buying a repurposed atmospheric turbine before I could run a diagnostic, it meant the turbine was rigged to explode. Kane was doing the exact same thing on a galactic scale. Pushing the coronation to the very next morning was a deliberate, calculated trap designed to ensure the Queen had absolutely zero time to investigate the modified protocols. We were placed in a sprawling, gilded suite that felt more like a high-security prison cell. Around midnight, the ornate mirror in the corner of the room swung open silently on hidden hinges. Admiral Thessaroon stepped out of the dark servant corridor, followed closely by a hunched, nervous man wrapped in heavy academic robes. She introduced him as Edrin Sol, a senior palace archivist who had spent the last 40 years cataloging the deep history of the Valoran Choir. Edrin possessed the pale, trembling demeanor of a man who knew far too many dangerous secrets. Without exchanging pleasantries, he handed me a heavy, insulated maintenance coat and told us to follow him. We abandoned the golden spires and the marble floors, descending deep into the architectural guts of the palace. This was my kind of territory. We slipped through a dizzying maze of damp, narrow ventilation shafts, squeezed past massive, vibrating coolant pipes, and navigated catwalks suspended over bottomless exhaust vents. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling faintly of ozone and ancient, burning copper. It was a suffocating, mechanical underworld that the citizens above never saw. After descending for roughly 2 hours, Edrin bypassed a massive, reinforced blast door using a decrypted maintenance cipher. We stepped into the true heart of the Empire. It was located directly beneath the throne room, but it was not a digital server farm or a dusty library. It was a sprawling, circular cavern filled with towering pillars of solid amber light. The pillars hummed with a low, agonizing frequency. As I walked closer, my modified datapad went completely berserk, registering massive spikes of localized neural energy. These were not data files. They were light prints. The throne did not simply erase the consciousness of the past monarchs. It extracted them and stored them down here in the dark. They were suspended in a horrifying state of digital purgatory, unable to die, unable to live, just echoing silently in the radiant amber. They are incredibly loud once you learn how to listen. The voice did not come from my earpiece or the physical air. It resonated directly inside the center of my skull, a sharp, echoing whisper that made my vision blur for a second. The central pillar of light shifted, the golden energy swirling and coalescing into the vague, shifting silhouette of a tall man. Nerissa let out a shattered, breathless gasp, pressing her hands against the reinforced glass of the pillar. It was Kaelor, her missing brother. His neural signature was fragmented, his voice carrying the static of immense, prolonged suffering. He told us the brutal truth of his disappearance. 5 years ago, he had uncovered the Regent's plot to modify the integration process. Kaelor had actively fought the machine during his preliminary rites, attempting to physically destroy the crown engine from the inside. He failed. Sorrel Kane had trapped him beneath the floorboards, integrating his consciousness into the archival core to keep him silent. But Kane had severely underestimated the stubbornness of the royal bloodline. Deep in the network, Kaelor found the fragmented, lingering consciousness of their late mother. Together, spending every ounce of their remaining digital strength, they managed to slice into the automated diplomatic courier system. They forged the delivery cipher and sent that glowing envelope to the rain-soaked streets of Tacoma, exactly when the Empire reached its breaking point. But Kaelor delivered a second revelation that completely shifted the axis of everything I thought I knew. He explained that Nerissa, choosing Earth, was not a random accident of navigation. Generations ago, Valoran scholars had secretly studied human neurology. They discovered something fascinating about the human mind. Our brains are incredibly dense with mundane, repetitive, ordinary memories. The act of paying a monthly water bill, the frustration of fixing a broken machine, the daily grind of shared domestic life, to a cosmic machine designed to process grand political ideologies and absolute, divine authority. Those small, gritty, human memories were fundamentally indigestible. They act as heavy, unbreakable psychological anchors. The throne is a predator that hunts for pride, ambition, and royal duty. Kaler's voice echoed in my mind, vibrating with desperate urgency. If you enter the chamber carrying only the weight of the crown, the machine will hollow you out in 10 seconds. It will rewrite you into a puppet for the council. But if you carry the absolute certainty of an ordinary, flawed life, the engine cannot process the contradiction. The protocol will stall. The ghost in the machine turned its shifting, faceless gaze toward me. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. Nerissa could not simply remember her time on Earth. She had to actively drag those mundane artifacts into the integration sequence to act as a physical virus against the royal programming. And more importantly, she needed a living, breathing grounding wire standing in the room. She needed the mechanic who yelled at her about leaving the lights on. Tomorrow morning, Sorrel Kane expected a terrified, compliant girl to sit on a throne of lies. Instead, we were going to walk into the most sacred room in the galaxy, armed with an overdue electric bill and a severe attitude problem. The morning of the ascension broke with a suffocating, weaponized elegance. I stood at the edge of the central processional dais, drowning in a sea of sensory overload. The sheer scale of the event was designed to crush the individual ego into absolute submission. Massive, impossibly tall towers of resonant crystal flanked the plaza, catching the morning winds and singing a continuous, harmonious chord that vibrated directly against my ribs. Thousands of levitating star lamps drifted lazily through the air, casting a warm, divine glow over the millions of citizens packed into the viewing tiers. Above us, swarms of metallic broadcast lenses hovered like eager insects, beaming the spectacle live to countless planetary systems across the dark expanse of the choir. Nerissa walked slowly toward the towering, heavily reinforced doors of the inner sanctum. She was buried under the crushing weight of imperial tradition. Her ceremonial armor was forged from pale, shifting metal and draped in layers of heavy, luminous silk that trailed 10 feet behind her. She looked like a flawless, untouchable deity, but my eyes were fixed on the slight, rigid stiffness in her posture. I knew exactly what she was hiding beneath those layers of priceless alien fabric. Pressed tightly against her ribcage, invisible beneath the ceremonial silk, were the ordinary fragments of Tacoma that had taught her who she was. I did not need to see them to know they were there. The procession halted just steps away from the sanctum doors. Regent Sorrel Kane stepped off the high altar, his dark robes sweeping across the polished stone. He raised a single hand, and the crystal towers instantly ceased their singing. The sudden silence was heavier than the noise. He turned his cold, calculating gaze entirely upon me. "The protocol dictates absolute purity," Kane announced, his voice amplified by unseen acoustics to reach every corner of the plaza and every broadcast feed in the galaxy. He pointed a long, accusatory finger at my chest. "Yet, a profound contaminant stands upon the sacred dais, an outsider from an unaligned, primitive dirt world. He possesses no rank, no clearance, and no understanding of our divine burdens. He pollutes the sanctity of the ascension. Guards, remove this human from the immediate vicinity of the throne." 2 towering palace enforcers stepped forward, their armor clicking menacingly. I did not back away. I reached into the pocket of my borrowed, slightly ill-fitting formal coat and gripped my heavily modified datapad. "I am not moving a single inch," I said, hitting the manual execute command on the screen. High above the plaza, hidden deep within the ornate architectural arches, the 4 hijacked maintenance drones I had rewired the night before sprang into action. They dropped from the shadows, their optical arrays blazing with high-intensity light. They bypassed the heavily censored Imperial broadcast network entirely and projected a massive, towering holographic document directly over the center of the crowd. It was the ancient, unredacted legal text Edrin Sol had helped me isolate. "Read it," I shouted, my voice echoing loudly in the tense silence. Section 4. Paragraph 9 of the Foundational Charter. The sovereign possesses the absolute, undeniable right to invoke a witness of plain life, a grounded observer immune to the jurisdiction of the High Court. You cannot legally remove me, Kane. I am her designated anchor. A massive ripple of shocked whispers tore through the millions of assembled citizens. They were seeing a fundamental imperial law that had been aggressively scrubbed from their public records for over 3 centuries. Kane's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. The polished facade finally cracked. He realized he could no longer manage the narrative through quiet manipulation. He had to use brute force. He gave a sharp, violent nod to the enforcers. Admiral Thessaroon immediately stepped into their path, drawing her ceremonial energy blade. "Stand down!" she roared, her voice echoing with decades of military command. "The law is clearly displayed. You will not lay a hand on the Queen's chosen witness." But the rot ran far deeper than a few loyal soldiers. Within 2 seconds, 6 members of her own elite vanguard unit turned their weapons directly upon her. They swiftly disarmed her, forcing the veteran commander to her knees in front of the entire galaxy. I quickly scanned the edges of the high altar, looking for Edrin Saul to corroborate the ancient text. But the nervous archivist had completely vanished. He was swept away into the dark machinery of Kane's political purge, while everyone was looking at the holograms. Right then, my datapad vibrated violently against my palm. A single, frantic burst of encrypted telemetry bled through the local network. It was Kaler, broadcasting a desperate warning from the digital purgatory beneath our feet. He had managed to push one final message through the floorboards. The translation flashed across my screen. Kane has successfully locked the integration circuit. If she sits on the chair now, the machine will bypass her biological safeguards entirely. The ego death will be instantaneous. I looked at Nerissa. She was staring at the heavy sanctum doors, the burden of a collapsing Stargate network pressing down on her shoulders. If she walked away, billions would starve in the dark. If she walked in, the woman I knew would cease to exist. I turned my back on the armed guards and faced the hovering broadcast lenses directly. I had a few seconds before Kane managed to jam the frequencies, and I intended to burn his entire empire to the ground with the truth. "Your perfect monarchy is a manufactured lie," I yelled, pushing every ounce of air out of my lungs to ensure the words carried across the void. "For centuries, you have been taught that your rulers achieve divine, objective wisdom. It is a biological scam. The throne is an archaic meat grinder. It violently rips away the private memories, the childhoods, and the very souls of the people who sit on it. It lobotomizes them to keep them compliant. Sorrel Kane and the Regency Council do not want a queen. They want an empty, smiling puppet so they can pull the strings from the shadows." The crowd erupted into absolute, terrifying chaos. The smooth, synchronized theater of the coronation shattered into a million jagged pieces. People were screaming, pointing at the holograms, and rushing the lower barricades. Sorrel Kane realized he had lost the public narrative. He slammed his fist onto a hidden console buried within the altar podium. "Activate the defense choir!" he bellowed over the rising riot. The crystal towers surrounding the plaza suddenly shifted their frequency from a pleasant, harmonious song to a deafening, weaponized screech. The sound slammed into me like a physical wall of concrete. It was an acoustic spatial lock. The air between myself and Nerissa instantly solidified, vibrating with an intensity that knocked me flat onto the polished stone floor. I tasted copper in my mouth. My ears rang with agonizing pressure. I tried to push myself up, tried to step forward, but the sonic barrier was completely impenetrable. It was designed to repel heavy artillery, and it easily kept a stubborn mechanic pinned to the ground. Kane had successfully severed the connection. I was trapped on the outside of the acoustic wall. Nerissa was trapped on the inside, standing entirely alone before the massive, groaning doors of the inner sanctum. The heavy locking mechanisms of the sanctum began to disengage, groaning with the weight of thousands of years of bloody history. She stood at the edge of the abyss, wrapped in silk and carrying a pocket full of earth garbage. To save the lives of the Outer Rim citizens, she had to step into the machine that had devoured her ancestors, her mother, and her brother. And she had to do it without her witness standing by her side to pull her back from the dark. The heavy doors parted, revealing the suffocating, pulsing amber glow of the Crown engine, waiting in the cavernous dark. Just before the massive slabs of metal began to swing shut again, Nerissa paused on the threshold. She slowly turned her head, looking through the shimmering, rippling distortion of the acoustic barrier. Her violet eyes locked onto mine. She did not look like a divine ruler in that exact fraction of a second. She looked exactly like the woman who used to sit on our frayed sofa and complain about the Tacoma rain. Then, she turned around and walked into the blinding amber light. The sanctum doors slammed shut with a definitive, world-ending boom, sealing the chamber completely. The heavy silence that followed was more terrifying than the riot raging behind me. She was trapped inside with the monster, and there was absolutely no way to know if the woman who eventually walked out of that room would be my roommate or just a beautiful hollow shell wearing her face. I spat the taste of copper onto the polished stone, glaring at the shimmering acoustic barrier separating me from the heavy sanctum doors. Sorrel Kane believed he had accounted for every single variable in his grand political equation. He forgot one crucial detail. I was a municipal mechanic. I spent my entire adult life crawling through the hidden, dirty spaces that arrogant architects tried to pretend did not exist. I rolled onto my stomach, ignoring the crushing pressure of the sonic wall, and scanned the base of the grand dais. There it was. A secondary thermal exhaust grate, barely visible behind a row of decorative marble statues, designed to vent excess heat from the subterranean machinery. I dragged myself toward it, out of the direct line of sight of the stunned guards. Using the titanium pry bar, I always kept tucked in my left boot. I popped the heavy grate loose. I slid into the narrow, suffocating shaft, plunging into absolute darkness. The air was blisteringly hot, smelling of burnt ozone and ancient grease. I crawled forward blindly for what felt like 10 agonizing minutes, guided only by the deafening, rhythmic thrum of the machine above me. I found a vertical access hatch, kicked the rusted latch open, and pulled myself upward. I tumbled out onto a cold metallic floor and immediately gasped for air. I was officially inside the forbidden center of the ascension ritual. The inner sanctum was not a room. It was an endless, terrifying ocean of living memory. The Crown engine dominated the cavernous space, a massive, swirling vortex of brilliant amber liquid light. Ethereal, overlapping voices cascaded through the air, the combined chorus of 100 dead monarchs. They were not speaking, they were demanding. They demanded absolute surrender. They whispered promises of divine clarity, urging the new vessel to shed the fragile, painful weight of her individual soul in exchange for the cold, perfect power of the Empire. Nerissa stood at the edge of the swirling light, trembling violently. The heavy silk of her ceremonial robes seemed to weigh her down like lead. She took one step toward the central chair, her eyes glazing over with a terrifying, blank obedience. Suddenly, the amber light violently shifted, pulsing with a sickly, corrupted crimson hue. A massive holographic projection of Sorrel Kane flickered into existence directly above the throne. He was not physically in the room, but he had triggered his final override. A hidden, parasitic neural implant, buried deep within the architecture of the chair, flared to life. Kane was using the protocol to hijack the network. He intended to force the throne to read Nerissa merely as an empty, biological gateway, a flesh and blood conduit that would grant him absolute, unfiltered control over the entire transit system, while leaving her permanently paralyzed. Nerissa fell to her knees, screaming as the corrupted red light reached out, wrapping around her wrists like physical chains. The machine was violently tearing her mind apart, searching for her ego so it could consume it. I did not have a weapon. I did not have an army. But I had my battered, grease-stained datapad, and I knew exactly how to crash a system. I sprinted across the sanctum floor, dodging violent arcs of stray neural energy. I threw myself at the base of the throne, ripping open the ornate golden paneling with my bare hands to expose the pulsing, biological fiber optics beneath. I jammed the heavy copper tether of my datapad directly into the exposed root of the machine. I did not try to hack the ancient imperial firewalls. I did not write a complex counter-virus. I simply opened my local storage drive and hit select all. I force-fed the Crown engine the entirety of our mundane, highly unglamorous 5 years on Earth. I uploaded digital receipts for cheap synthetic noodles. I uploaded 300 hours of audio logs featuring us aggressively arguing over whose turn it was to take out the recycling. I injected scanned copies of past due electric bills, grainy video clips of her laughing so hard at a terrible joke that she spilled coffee on the rug, and my own detailed, incredibly boring daily maintenance logs. The ancient, godlike machine slammed into a catastrophic processing error. It was designed to consume grand political ambitions, military strategies, and royal pride. It had absolutely no idea how to digest the concept of splitting rent. The suffocating crimson light of Kane's override stuttered, choked by the sheer, chaotic volume of ordinary human existence. The throne recognized the data not as a threat, but as the one missing component from every single prior reign, a genuine, unedited, beautifully flawed personal life. The mundane details acted as massive, unbreakable psychological anchors. Nerissa gasped, her violet eyes snapping wide open, the terrifying blankness vanishing entirely. She reached into her robes and pulled out the physical anchors, clutching the faded transit card and the chipped ceramic mug against her chest. She stood up, fighting against the pull of the vortex. She did not let the throne consume her. She reached her hand into the amber light and forced the machine to merge with her on her own terms. The entire cavern erupted in a blinding flash of pure, warm gold. The backlash was instantaneous and devastating. The Crown engine, now fully synchronized with a sovereign who possessed absolute clarity, traced the corrupted Crimson Code directly back to its source. On the Grand Plaza outside, and across billions of screens spanning the entire galaxy, the system violently expelled Sorel Kane. It did not kill him. It did something far worse to a man obsessed with authority. The throne publicly broadcast every single line of his treasonous code, exposing his conspiracy to the entire choir. The acoustic barrier shattered. Palace enforcers immediately surrounded the regent, stripping him of his badges and his rank right there on the altar. He was left kneeling on the stone, completely powerless, destroyed by the very institution he sought to manipulate. Inside the sanctum, the storm of memories began to settle into a gentle, rhythmic hum. Nerissa stood tall, the glowing light fading back into the architecture. She raised her hand, issuing her first absolute command as a fully realized sovereign. She ordered the engine to release the exiles. A profound, peaceful sigh echoed through the chamber. The trapped, agonizing neural signatures of Kaelor and their mother drifted up from the digital depths. They manifested for one brief, beautiful second, smiling warmly at the new queen, before finally dissolving into the peaceful, silent rest they had been denied for years. The horrific, memory-eating cycle of the Valoran choir was permanently broken. When the heavy sanctum doors finally opened again, Nerissa stepped out into the sunlight. She accepted the title of queen, but the very first decree she issued dismantled the absolute monarchy. She fractured the centralized power, handing vast administrative control back to the regional systems. She legally mandated that every future ruler must bring a witness of plain life into the court, ensuring that no one would ever be allowed to become a hollow, soulless symbol again. 8 months later, I found myself lying on my back, covered in grease, actively wrestling with a highly temperamental atmospheric filtration unit. The major difference was that this particular filter was located inside a newly constructed, heavily reinforced maintenance workshop on the east wing of the royal palace. The heavy steel door of my shop slid open. Nerissa walked in, wearing an elegant, simple gown, having just returned from a highly successful trade negotiation with the Outer Rim delegates. The entire galaxy bowed to her now. People painted murals of her face on distant border worlds. But she ignored the grand, velvet-lined chairs I had set up for guests. She walked straight over to my incredibly messy, tool-covered workbench. She brushed a stray coil of copper wire out of the way, sat down on a dented metal stool, and picked up the old, cracked ceramic mug she kept sitting right next to my soldering iron. She took a slow sip of hot coffee, looking perfectly serene amidst the chaotic clutter of my workspace. The Empire would sing songs about her grand return for the next 1,000 years. But right here, in the quiet grease and the gentle hum of the machinery, we kept the real truth alive. She was not a savior because she possessed royal blood. She saved the universe because she spent 5 years learning how to live exactly like a normal, highly frustrating, wonderfully ordinary human being. Thank you so much for listening to this story today. Please drop a comment below and let me know where you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. I invite you to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like the video, and support us even further by pressing the hype button so the story in this video can be heard by many more people.